Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kurida, and I am from the Development Action Group, as I'm sure you're all well aware by now. Firstly, I'd like to say welcome to our second Urban Forum. This is today an exciting day for us because we've been running this series since the beginning of this year, and today is the day of our second Urban Forum. Perhaps maybe just to start, I would like to give a little bit of information about DAG and the work that we do. DAG is an NGO working in housing and land, and we've been doing this for more than 30 years. We support communities in their efforts to access housing, basic services, and land. And we do this through building their capacity and equipping them to advance their own housing rights. We have a long history in advocacy, implementation, and our work on the release of state land for social and affordable housing. What I'd like to do now is talk about our Urban Forum, the first one, which we held in June this year, which many of you, I'm sure, attended with us. The forums, or DAG's Urban Forum, forms part of our Urban Land and Housing Dialogue series, which will run for 3 years. The Urban Forums are strategic platforms where those with interest in the land and housing sector come together to discuss challenges and opportunities. And ultimately, the aim of this is to achieve urban spatial transformation. In simple terms, that is cities that are equally open and accessible to everybody, from the poor and the working class to the rich and the wealthy. Our first Urban Forum, or the webinar, brought together different role players and voices working or affected by issues in land and housing to share knowledge and discuss coordinated responses to the lack of access to allocated land and housing. We had 5 panelists discussing various issues. In particular, the themes they focused on were the release of land for housing, de-densification, tenure security, public participation, informality, and access to basic services. A key issue that emerged from the Urban Forum is that of evictions and insecure tenure, particularly in the context of backyards and informality. This includes evictions instituted by both private and public actors. Picking up on this very important issue is what led us to our second urban forum. With this webinar, our theme is therefore the impacts of COVID-19 on the rental housing sector, evictions and inadequate tenure and security in a time of crisis. Now, just to give you a little bit of context in this regard, despite various protections that exist in law and policy and so forth, during the national lockdown and different alert levels, we saw a number of unlawful evictions happening across the country. And the significant upsurge in evictions during this time of crisis really illustrated the extent of insecure tenure across the country, with many people either evicted or currently facing the threat of eviction by both state and private property owners. Mostly where evictions have occurred, those responsible failed to provide alternative accommodation, thus rendering evictees homeless and more vulnerable to the risk of infection. On 2nd September, Human Rights Watch reported that during the national lockdown, public representatives demolished more than 58,000 temporary homes on state land in Cape Town, while many people were evicted from informal settlements, disused government buildings, and public spaces in cities across the country. These type of evictions and demolitions have shown how urban residents really have insecure tenure and how they need to be assisted in terms of both preventing evictions and supporting them while they're going through an eviction. So the purpose of this discussion today then really is to determine and share information regarding what kind of support functions exist for both tenants and landlords. Essentially, we want to have a conversation around what the key responses and solutions are and what forms of recourse exist for persons who have been evicted or currently facing an eviction, and also what options are open to landlords. So we have an exciting panel of 4 people who will then share their experiences, reflections, and thoughts with you today. To start off, we want to get a perspective from the ground. We want to actually speak to people who are, or hear from people who are affected by evictions, so that we don't have a conversation in a vacuum where it doesn't really speak to the issues on the ground. Leading that conversation will be Vuyani. Vuyani is from the Khayelitsha Peace Building team, and he will share his thoughts and experiences in that regard. Second after that, we will have Mpho from Ndifuna Ukwazi, and she will speak about the advice assemblies that they are managing. After her, we'll have Lauren Royston from the Socioeconomic Rights Institute of South Africa, or SERI as they're well known, and she will speak on alternative accommodation. And finally, we're quite excited to have from the Rental Housing Tribunal, Commissioner du Plessis, who will discuss the mandate and the role of the Rental Housing Tribunal in terms of evictions and land tenure. So maybe just in terms of process, like I discussed, we will have 2 sessions. In the first session, Vuyani and Mpho will share their perspectives. After that, shortly after that, we will have a poll question. I will alert you when the poll is coming up. Please respond to the question. We really want to hear your perspective. And then we'll have a Q&A session. For the first Q&A, we would like you to pose questions specifically related to the first presentations. And then after that, we will have our second session. The second session, Lauren from SERI and Commissioner du Plessis will share their views. And again, after that session, we'll have a poll. And following the poll, we will have a Q&A where similarly, I would like the questions to revolve mainly around the presentations made by those 2 speakers. Finally, we will have a plenary discussion where any and all questions related to the topic of evictions and tenure security may be asked, and where we can also discuss broader issues around urban land reform in particular. I have someone, just to let you know, I have someone assisting me in terms of working through your questions and comments. We will do our best to address all of them, or have our panel address all of them on this platform. But should we be unable to do so, we will follow up with unanswered questions and comments through alternative mechanisms, either directly or indirectly. And just to note that we want this webinar to be as interactive as possible. I therefore invite all of you to participate freely by posting your questions and comments or responses in the Zoom chat function at the bottom of the screen. And then maybe just to reflect on who is in the room, who our audience is. The majority of the participants today are from community-based organizations, which is really useful because, like I said, we want to focus on solutions. We want to focus on different avenues that are open to people who are either working in the sector or who are affected by evictions and tenure insecurity. We also have a number of academics and civil society organizations participating, as well as representatives from government participating in the webinar. And with that said, I think I would like to move on to the first speaker, who is Vuyani. Let me just give you a brief background of who Vuyani is. Vuyani is a human rights activist. He is co-founder and the current chairperson of the Khayelitsha Peace Building Team, a human rights organization based in Khayelitsha. As an activist and chairperson of the Khayelitsha Peace Building Team, Vuyani has successfully advocated and monitored human rights violations such as violence against women and immigrants, as well as asylum seekers. Vuyani is a community activist and alumni of DAG's Active Citizens Training course. He's also the former deputy chairperson of the Social Justice Coalition and the former provincial executive member of the Treatment Action Campaign in the Western Cape. Vuyani, are you ready to start with your presentation?
Yes, my sister, I'm ready.
Perfect. You have 15 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good day to everyone, my fellow South Africans. I'm glad to be with you this afternoon. My name is Vuyani Ngate, and I'm a member of Khayelitsha Peace Building Team. I would really want to share my experiences and the challenges that I have experienced, and as an organization, Khayelitsha Peace Building Team, what we have experienced since the lockdown, since March 26. Right. Personally, it was such an extraordinary and unprecedented circumstance that came with COVID-19, because for the first time that I, as an individual, had to experience such thing called lockdown. I have never been locked down. The only thing I know during the apartheid days was a curfew, and yes, so that was the name of the game, curfew. If you stay in the township, then you'll be like given times and areas where you can live and walk at what time. So yeah, it was a new experience altogether. The first thing what I've experienced that when the lockdown was introduced, then I found myself having to stay with my brother and my whole family 24 hours a day in this small house, because some of us are taking night shift. They go and work late in the evening. They will come the next day. And then the following day in the morning, I prepare myself, then I leave. And so for those who are working the night shift can be accommodated with this small box size house, you know. So during the day I'm at work, and during the night I'm sleeping. So my family members, those who are working, they work night shift. So in the night they are out there working, they will come the following day. So we have that routine. But all of a sudden, boom, lockdown. All of us have to stay here with our kids, my brother and my sister's kids, all of us were here day and night. So there was no schooling. So even kids have to stay with us here. It was such a strenuous kind of a situation, but we coped anyway as families. Now here we are. In our communities, immediately after that lockdown, and then the reality of the matter came up. Like you could see poverty out there, people having to stay at home, having nothing to eat. Hence, we are a community-based organization. People would come to us. And our office was locked. Also, we couldn't go to the office. So we had to work from home. what we did as an organization, we organized food parcels, giving out to those whom we can afford to give to. But it was such a small kind of a drop in the ocean. But we did what we could afford to assist our communities. We managed to distribute some kind of food parcels, reasonable, to the community in the Site C and outside Site C in Kailicha, and also hygienic necessities. Okay, fine. What happened is that it became impossible that as a community-based organization so small, we could really cater for these different communities. So we looked around and spoke to one of reliable partner organizations such as DAG. They came to the fore in terms of assisting us to distribute hygienic necessities and other stuff, right? And then all of a sudden there was this wave of people complaining that they cannot afford to pay rent because they've been paying rent for all of these years at somebody's flat at the backyard. Some of them, they paying rent, staying in shacks at the back of somebody's RDP house, but they could not afford because they were not working. Now, we had to find alternatives. There were no alternatives. The only alternative that was there was a piece of land across the road, in Lansdowne Road, just at the back of our house. There's a nice big piece of land there. It's next to the station. That piece of land is like a buffer zone between Kailicha and Mitchell's Plain, Lindagie. So we earmarked that piece of land for us, those who are landless. We could see that that open space can be utilized for us to really find an alternative accommodation there. So we went there. We started occupying the land. Unfortunately, the law enforcers came, they chased us. And we kept on looking for another alternative because we could not stay the way we were staying, as we were required also to observe and maintain social distancing and other regulations pertaining the coronavirus kind of. So it was like becoming hectic. So we find another alternative, a piece of land. This piece of land comes from, it's a strip of land that comes from Fuleni up to R300 behind Drip Sands. There's a nice piece of land there. So when we discovered that piece of land, we saw it necessary to occupy that piece of land. We did so. We did so. No one actually mobilized us to do that as individual families. We just saw it necessary to do that. We did it. We started occupying land there. We called it a name immediately, and its name became COVID-19. That is the new township that is there. In a few days' time, we saw hundreds of people coming to actually acquire some kind of piece of land for their own families. And then before we knew it, the land was finished. Every piece of land was like barricaded, someone claiming that this piece of land is meant for this particular family. So we started now organizing ourselves. We decided to elect representatives for us. So those who will represent us formally and talk to those who are in power to negotiate this process of land occupation. So we have our own representatives. Every Saturday, they give us feedbacks on what has been happening during the course of the week. So that's how we get to know what is going to happen to us. But in between, we experience a lot of evictions. Today it's called evictions, but the previous government, the white government, used to call it forced removals. Yes. So today it's called evictions. All right, fine. Law enforcement came from the city of Cape Town. They started demolishing our shacks. And yes, we had to endure that pain. But what we did, we regrouped after they have destroyed our houses. We regrouped and we started building again to show them that we have nowhere to stay. These are our homes. We have built them by ourselves, for ourselves, amongst ourselves. We are a new community here. Right. What happened is that now people could not rebuild, some of them could not rebuild their houses as they were destroyed and confiscated by the city of Cape Town, the law enforcement. Now, someone said to us, we need to renegotiate with the law enforcement, claiming that those building materials belong to us, not to them. They did not bring material here. We brought this material to build up our homes. So our representatives started negotiating with the law enforcers. Well, it was said that, okay, those who found themselves having no building materials, their homes have been destroyed by the city of Cape Town, they could go back and reclaim their building materials. But that never materialized anyway, because even to go there and start reclaiming your building material is another challenge, right? You'll be asked so many questions. So there are still those who cannot afford to rebuild their houses, but their spaces to build their houses, to rebuild their houses are still there. Fine. Because we look after each other as neighbors. We have built this new neighborhood. So everything we do is neighborly. Wonderful. And we continue to receive these threats from the law enforcement, from the city of Cape Town, that after the certain date, we will get evicted. And then we invited them. We invite them to say, well, you can come and evict us, but make sure that you evict us and reallocate us at the same time. But that one, it becomes our baby also, reallocation. So they are good at destroying, but they are not good in rebuilding. That's the city of Cape Town. Anyway, after that experience, we also experienced Mother Nature coming to us. Mother Nature visited us a month ago as a gale force was blowing all over. What happened is that most of the houses got blown away by the gale force that engulfed the whole peninsula. So we lost our homes. Those who could regain their houses, those who managed to regain their building materials, they regain their building materials because we have to run around looking for it. So they got it's kept somewhere there in the neighborhood, but they cannot afford now to build it up again. We thought perhaps the city of Cape Town might come around this time and start supporting us in rebuilding our houses, as the gale force has blown away our houses. But unfortunately, it seems the city of Cape Town saw it as another way of eviction. So they never actually assisted us up till today. We saw the city of Cape Town running around assisting other people who don't really need this assistance. They never came to us in that new development. Anyway, we've got so many challenges still there. Besides those challenges that I have just mentioned to you, we still have no streets, no water, running water. There's nothing there. There is no light. There is no even hope that the city of Cape Town will come on board in terms of giving out the proper service delivery that we need as it is citizens of this country, not lawbreakers, no, as loyal citizens of this country, law-abiding citizens of this country. We thought maybe this time around the city of Cape Town will come on board. Unfortunately, the city of Cape Town is nowhere to be found, but they still call themselves a caring city. Right. In all spheres of government anyway, we haven't found any kind of assistance. I must say that. And yeah, moving on. There is a threat that keeps on coming back to us to say before the end of the month, those who have not built their homes won't be allowed to build their homes there. Now the question is, did you send us there? Who are you to tell us that it's a deadline? We have no deadline. We came there voluntarily. We did what we did in our own piece of land. Now someone comes from nowhere is telling us that there's a deadline here now. Okay, never mind. We believe that the land belongs to the city of Cape Town and Cape Nature. And for them to stay away from us, not engaging with us, does not help, does not assist the situation to find amicable solutions. Because there are dams there, and also it was a Cape Nature, so we don't really know on how to coexist with nature, the wild nature. Now, we expected that Cape Nature will come on board and really do some kind of workshopping us as new residents of that area on how to coexist with wildlife, with ecosystem that is there, right? Without us destroying the ecosystem, the nature, the environment that is there. So we're still waiting on that. Perhaps we still have to find ways and means of finding each other. I don't know. By the way, moving on, how do you expect someone to rent a house during lockdown? It's impossible. That's one of the reasons we decided to go and occupy that open land. Right. Someone have asked me that, do you have any assistance perhaps from one of your partner organizations or civil society? No, not yet, except that individual organizations have been asking us on what is it that we can do to assist the situation. We haven't really found a common ground where we can say this, we will move from this point A to point B. How are we going to move? We still have to formalize all of that. But as community-based organization, Kailicha Peace Building Team cannot do that alone because of very limited resources. And yeah, media comes and go. You know, media, they will always be there. Yeah, there's no kind of any kind of assistance. Let me stop there. If anything that you might want to know from me, from my side, I will gladly engage with you. Thank you for now. So yeah, that's it, Kurida. And you must also bear in mind that we are only 30 minutes away from, 30 kilometers away from Cape Town. So it's quite strenuous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vuyani. I think those were some really useful inputs that sort of really captures the experience of somebody who has been affected by evictions beyond all of what we hear in the media, beyond what the politicians say about it, and beyond what experts write about it. So thank you so much for your contribution. I'm immediately going to move over to Mpho from NU, who's going to share with us how they supported communities through their advice assemblies during this time. Mpho holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree in Politics, Philosophy and Economics and an LLB from the University of Cape Town. She completed her articles with the Legal Resources Center in 2017 and was a Bertha Justice Fellow. Mpho is currently an attorney at the Urban Land Justice Organization, NU, and leads their Resisting Evictions and Displacement Task Team. So she really is well placed to respond to these issues. Before I hand over to Mpho, I just want to remind you all to post your questions and comments in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have our panel respond to them after these two presentations. Thank you, Mpho.
Thanks, Creator. And welcome to everybody on the webinar. I'd just like to start by giving a brief introduction to what advice assemblies are. Advice assembly is a space where tenants and activists share information and knowledge about evictions and rental law. There they advise each other and support one another in their struggles for affordable housing. AAs, or advice assemblies, were born out of a recognition that if we're going to make systemic changes on how tenants are being treated, then we need to build tenant power. This is possible when tenants stand together and are able to provide quality advice to each other. So taking inspiration from La Paz in Barcelona, Reclaim the City and activists at Ndifuna set up an advice assembly in late 2017, thereby creating a space where there could be a shift from victimhood to agency over one's issues with the benefit of solidarity. Reclaim the City and Ndifuna support tenants in the inner city and surrounds who are struggling with their landlords, struggling to pay or keep up with skyrocketing rents, who are being unlawfully evicted, and even in the context of the lockdown, who are facing homelessness and displacement. Too many families who have spent centuries in these areas are looking at displacement, and this is an increasingly urgent problem, perpetuated even more so by the lockdown. One of these tenants is Mr. Lumumba Chia. I'll let him tell his story about advice assemblies himself.
Very confused at that time. Went to Ndifuna, and I was told that it was about reclaiming the city. And I went
Mpho, your connection is really bad. Mpho?
Hello?
Yes, maybe you want to skip through the video. Yes, you might want to skip through the video because your connection is quite bad and we couldn't hear any of your video.
Okay. No problem. What
we can't hear you at all, Mpho. Okay, so I think while we're trying to sort out Mpho and her connection, Maybe we could ask a few questions to yourself, Uyani. Is that all right? Uyani?
Hi, Kunita, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, I can. Is it okay if we ask some questions to you in the meantime?
You are more than welcome.
I think maybe as a start, you could reflect on where you see the issue of land going within Khayelitsha and how the issue of land should be dealt with by the city of Cape Town, ideally, so that people struggling with access to land and housing are better served by the city.
Okay. Khayelitsha, the history of Khayelitsha in the first place is a history of forced removals, right? Since the end of Group Areas Act, we have experienced rapid urbanization that resulted in overpopulation in our areas of residence. Now, here we are. Here we are in this new dispensation. We thought that there will be some kind of land redistribution to accommodate those who have been landless for all of these centuries. But unfortunately, it was not the case up until today. There is land. There is land. The city of Cape Town, what do? In every piece of land that they see, that they own anyway, they put it on the market for developers. And then we are left with no other option to find other alternatives. One of the alternatives is mushrooming of informal settlement. Now, the city of Cape Town need to come to the fore, engage with the civil society, because they cannot do it alone. They need to engage with the civil society, all the relevant stakeholders, in identifying land for residential purposes, other than prioritizing the land for commercial purposes. So, yes, we do have land in Khayelitsha still, but the city of Cape Town need to put services, infrastructure in place so that those open land or spaces can be conducive for residential purposes. Normally what they do, they will reallocate people without any kind of infrastructure, saying, no, that's a temporal residential area. But we always find ourselves, sorry for that. We always find ourselves having to stay there for life. Now, the city of Cape Town, it is obvious that they have been doing things not consulting. Instead, they are doing things their own way, which keeps on creating these confrontations. There is land. There is a land just across the road here. I believe that land has been sold somewhere, I don't know. So without consulting communities around this piece of land, this will continue. I prefer engagement and proper engagement in land identification for residential purposes. That's the thing. That's where it misses the point, the city of Cape Town. To avoid these confrontations and these so-called illegal occupations. I don't know what is illegal occupation anyway.
Thank you, Vianney. I think you make a very important point around the identification of land and how it's used and the extent to which the people who are most affected should be involved in that conversation. We're going to switch over now to Mpho to start with her presentation again.
Okay. Let's try this again. Thanks, curator. I've been advised not to play the video. It seems to be the cause of the slow in connection. But I'll just summarize what Comrade Lumumba Chia was talking about. He was essentially giving his own experience of advice assembly at a point where he was faced with an impending eviction, very confused, as he said, not knowing which first step to take. And fortunately, he found a home of sorts where other activists who have been through similar situations were able to listen to him, take away that sense of shame and being alone in the eviction process, but also guide him through the next steps of a lawful eviction, ultimately referring him to Ndifunukwazi's Law Center, which dealt with his eviction matter. So what we learned from his experience and with others is that overcoming shame, getting to tell your story, being heard are very powerful in shifting the blame mindset and starting a journey towards taking action. Information and confidence can go a long way, especially in the context of this state of disaster, where legislative gaps had to be filled by things like good faith negotiations and communities taking initiatives when engaging with law enforcement bodies, including the Anti-Land Invasion Unit.
Excuse me, Paul. I think it might be best if you switch off your video function and not use that. At the bottom of your screen, yes. Okay. In parts, you're going away. So maybe just switch off the video and then we can look at your presentation and listen. Great, thanks, Mpho.
All right, so advice point chapter meter. So advice assemblies usually take place at Woodstock and Sea Point chapter meetings. Yet with COVID-19 and the resultant lockdown, we were required to come to maintain this platform. We foresaw a situation in which people would not only be facing situations of tenure insecurity, but also income insecurity and the ever-present health risk at their door. We therefore took the advice assemblies to several platforms, streaming podcasts on SoundCloud, Facebook Live, and as we are currently doing now, on radio, while working towards a partnership with Cape Town TV. Each of these platforms have their own pros and cons, but essentially, we were able to reach wider audiences and created an opportunity to engage in tenant issues outside of the chapter or traditional RTC chapter areas. Specifically, the lockdown in the context of and that repetitive cycle between the unlawful eviction of backyardists, for instance, the occupation of vacant land, and this. At this point, I had another video which would showcase us working together or having what we now call a pop-up advice assembly in one of these communities. Traditionally, advice assemblies didn't reach communities like Imizamo Yetu in Hout Bay. But as I said, the lockdown lockdown presented us with the opportunity to work with specific and unique issues which extend beyond tenant issues. Is a wide pandemic and the result the destruction and confiscation of building material, often with gratuitous violence. So this has created this opportunity for us to intervene with much needed rights education, working towards the communities, with the communities, understanding of the existing protections under the law, especially the legislated moratorium on evictions, and more recently, for instance, the interim interdict obtained against the City of Cape Town by the South African Human Rights Commission. But still, despite the moratorium on evictions, many people have been subjected to extrajudicial evictions and illegal demolitions of their homes by both state and private actors. Although no real comprehensive study has been done on the number of evictions in South Africa during COVID-19 pandemic, extrajudicial evictions and illegal demolitions have continued to take place without proper legal safeguards and accountability mechanisms, particularly without the provision of adequate alternative accommodation to those who have been rendered homeless as a result of these evictions. It's particularly concerning to witness state actors themselves nullifying the national state of disaster regulations with a seeming impunity and the shirking of their constitutional duties towards those facing homelessness. This has then led us to providing more practical steps for communities who are confronted with law enforcement agencies and unlawful evictions without court orders, as seen here. We are down level 1, and the legislative moratorium on evictions is in place until the end of the national state of disaster. This protection is limited to the extent that a court finds it just and equitable to order an eviction during level 1, but this protection is also bolstered by some of the COVID-related factors that a court must take into consideration before ordering an eviction, as seen here. Similarly, with Regulation 71, this regulation augments the Rental Housing Act and its regulations, which governs the landlord-tenant relationship and delineates unfair practices earlier phases of lockdowns to negotiate around their situation gap. Here, the regulations provide for unfair. There is the use of lockdown-related circumstances as a basis for termination of leases. And now, some significant findings from advice assemblies and the expanded version of advice. Prior to lockdown, a concept of tenure, the knowledge of one's rights and empowerment. Well, the knowledge of one's rights is empowering in a patently disempowering situation. There continues to be an alarming number of unaware of their rights. Fortunately, it continues to be the case, ongoing for decades, remain terminates outside of legal lockdown has shown us that law existence of unlawful is a sizable group of tenants who are experiencing major issues with social housing institutions, and this we've learned through engagements on other platforms like radio, for instance.
Excuse me, Paul. I think it might be useful if you... Paul, I think it might be useful if you stop sharing your screen. Paul? Paul?
Hello?
Yes, do you want to conclude
Yes.
your... Okay.
Rita?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sure. South Africa has adopted a gradual lifting of the lockdown and phased reopening of economic activity. And with this, we anticipate an overwhelming wave of evictions. For instance, the user traffic on eviction support sites like Open Up have increased to 4,300 visits in the month of June alone, compared to a pre-lockdown average of 300 visits per month. This can only show us or give us an estimation of the number of people who are facing eviction during lockdown and as a result of lockdown. The honest acknowledgement that this public health crisis creates an undue burden on society is critical. Yet what is of more importance is the recognition that poor and tenure insecure cannot be made to bear the cost at the expense of their lives. And so we have been calling for the state to implement more comprehensive tenant and mortgage payer support in line with the Special Rapporteur's COVID-19 guidance notes recommendations. This call has largely fallen on deaf ears for now. Government departments insist on calling on banks to give landlords reprieve in order to pass the savings on to tenants. There has been some benefit given to social housing institutions, but this is simply not enough. What is being done now with these stopgap measures is simply kicking the can further down the road. As we speak, people are placed in the untenable position of having to choose between feeding their families and keeping a roof over their heads. And if the preservation of life and the prioritization of a preventative response is our goal, then it is necessary that the home continues to be the primary defense against COVID-19 for all in our country. I think that's good. Okay, so that concludes my presentation, Creator.
Thank you, Paul, for your contributions. I think we're going to have a few minutes for questions and answers now. And I'll start by posing your questions to the presenters. Firstly, to Vuyani, a question that came up is, what is the current status of engagement with the City of Cape Town? Are you having conversations with the city at this point? Are you attempting to do so? If not, and what are you discussing? What are you trying to have achieved when you just have discussions with the City of Cape Town? And a second question related to that is, what is your response to the notion that land occupations happen as a result of, that it is politically driven, notwithstanding the background and the context and your experiences which you've described earlier? So I think let's go to Vuyani for those questions. And maybe, Paul, when you respond, you can answer these questions. Who are the people that are seeking support from the advice assemblies? And how many people are attending the advice assemblies? Is it more inner city or backyarders? And how can communities request for pop-up advice assemblies and support from yourselves? I'll hand over to Vuyani and Mpo to respond to those questions. Vuyani, would you like to go ahead?
Okay, yes, thanks for that. The city of Cape Town, from the beginning, they have never tried and find a middle ground on how to resolve this land issue amicable. Instead, they have been trying to drive us out, but they have failed because of our resistance. But we do not want that kind of a relationship. We want a good working relationship between the city of Cape Town and us as community members and also community-based organizations. This problem can only be resolved if we both, the community-based organization and the city of Cape Town, can find a common ground and sit under a round table or under a same roof and start negotiating, trying to find solutions on this matter. That hasn't happened since then. Instead, we regularly receive threats that after the lockdown, after level 1, will be evicted. We don't know. But yes, those threats are still there. We would really love to find each other, to find a solution, a win-win kind of a solution. But seemingly, the city of Cape Town, as it well-resourced as it is unwilling or not interested to come and speak to us. But we would really love to speak to them because we have our own representative that we have elected. They have never invited those representatives to engage with them in trying to find the solutions in this matter. No. But if they can come to us in a way to say, we would love to meet you, we will definitely meet up with them and resolve this matter once and for all, because we need services. We need those services. They are the only custodians that we are looking up to in terms of service delivery, right? So we cannot work the way that we are working with them now. It's not healthy. It's not a healthy working kind of a relationship. No ways. If they are in this conference, I'm inviting them. I'm extending my invitation to them. Let's meet and start talking about the solutions, not creating this kind of situation that is not, it hasn't been working. The other one is pushing the other one that side, and then the other one is resisting. You understand? It won't work. It has never worked before, and it will never work. The only way that we can find each other is to sit down and try to find solutions that will benefit both sides. Thank you. The second question: land occupation is not politically driven. It is not politically driven at all. Yes, you might get here and there opportunists, political opportunists that would want to hijack the momentum. No, we are fully aware of those. And we have dealt with them. We have dealt with them at the beginning to say, this is not a political campaign. This is a community-based driven kind of a campaign or a revolution. I don't know which a suitable word you might use. But basically, we are only looking for a piece of land where we can build our homes in a bigger space, not live at the backyard, not paying rent, and then during the lockdown, you get chased away by your landlord. No, we want our own piece of land. But the politicians, they might find a fertile ground. Well, yes, I'm aware of that. We are all aware of that. They might find it as a fertile ground to start campaigning for whatever reasons, for their political career. But we are not interested. We are not interested in political campaigns here. We are interested in service delivery. We are interested in street lights. We are interested in clinics. We are interested we are interested for someone who come and assist us in terms of creating a conducive environment for our elders. They must find a place, a suitable place to stay. We are interested for someone who will come and start assisting us, supporting us, build creches there for our kids and schools. Not someone to come and advance his or her own political career there. We have chased them away. They tried to do that, but we chased them away. We silenced them anyway. So this is not politically driven. Yes, we were driven by circumstances that were unprecedented, like COVID-19 regulations, where we had to observe social distancing. How do you observe social distance in such a small house with no playgrounds, nothing around? The perimeter is so small that you can't even accommodate a family with extended family members. How much more if there are backyarders in the same family house? It becomes impossible practically, right? So those are the factors that drove us away. Not that we left our places of residence by choice, but we were driven out of the place of residence by circumstances, right? Yes, not by political aspirations of someone who wants to be sitting somewhere in a powerful position in government tomorrow. No. Even today, there hasn't been any political or politician who has come to us. And yes, one or two government officials who would want to speak to individuals, in trying to actually advance his own aspirations, but no. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I have answered your question properly or the way, but we can always engage further after this webinar.
Yes, thank you, Vianney. Mpo, do you want to very briefly respond to those questions?
Sure, I'll keep it short. So the first question relates to who's seeking support from the AAs. Essentially, pre-lockdown, it was advice assemblies were tailored towards tenants facing landlord issues in the inner city and the surrounds. Hence, the AAs would take place at RTC chapter meetings in Sea Point and Woodstock. During lockdown and subsequently, we've managed to extend our engagement to other communities, given the issues that were coming up specifically during the lockdown. And those other communities include Khayelitsha, Imizamo Yethu in Hout Bay, like I've mentioned, Mfuleni, Philippi, and a lot more than that. And these communities were able to reach us through our partnerships with other entities like the Khayelitsha Can, for instance, like the Social Justice Coalition, and from INU's other work in these specific communities. So that's how they gained access to us. It was largely tailored towards tenant issues in the inner city and not so much dealing with backyard issues until lockdown happened. And to the extent that we deal with backyarder issues, it was largely around the protections under the law. So imparting that rights-based education with regard to what landlords can and can't do, specifically during lockdown, but also how they can protect their insecure tenure, whether they were still in that backyarder context or had moved to vacant land, moved to occupy vacant land. Then the last question relating to how one can request for these pop-up type advice assemblies. I think get into contact with us at Ndifuna Wazi. You can also get into contact with the Social Justice Coalition, whichever is closest to you, and we'd be able to take it forward with regards to organizing an AA in your area.
Thank you, Paul. I am immediately going to shift over to the second session, and I'm aware that there are many questions to which we haven't provided responses yet, and that's really because we only have 2 hours to have this webinar, so I'm managing time as well as your questions. Our next speaker is Lauren Royston from SERI. Lauren is a part-time senior associate at SERI, where she recently led SERI's development of the alternative accommodation policy brief. She currently works with PLUS and PARI on a land administration multi-stakeholder consultation project. A development planner by training, Lauren also has a master's degree in creative writing. She has a deep commitment to social justice and people-centered development, which she has applied for over 30 years with public interest social justice organizations, urban and rural development NGOs, civic organizations, and the public sector. Her fields of expertise are land and housing, with a particular focus on tenure security and urban land reform. Lauren has co-authored 2 books on tenure security, Holding Their Ground with Ellen Durant Reserve, and Untitled with Donna Hornby, Rosalie Kingswell, and Ben Cousins. Lauren, you can start your presentation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
I'll leave my video off then, just for the sake of the connection as well. Great. Okay, so let me get going. I just wanted to start by thanking DAG for the opportunity. I'm here in Nomzamo Zondo's stead. She was unable to make it, but I'm very glad of the opportunity. We've worked together on alternative accommodation for many years. I think that I wanted to start by saying something about the context. So I think that others have spoken to this, and I just wanted to connect it to the presentation slides that are going to follow. I think essentially the issue is around the management of unauthorized land occupation and illegal or extrajudicial evictions, as Paul referred to, and illegal demolitions. So that's the current context. I think that often when we talk about alternative accommodation in the context or the aftermath of litigation, it's often ignored that the context of occupation is in fact around the failure of the state, the failure of the market to deliver affordable formal housing options to people in need. And secondly, that the state hasn't yet provided affordable accommodation at sufficient scale. So it's important to, I noted Vuyani's response to the question about the politicization of occupations, but I think his response really helps us because it's clear from the work that we're doing and from what the law says, the case law says, that occupiers' needs should be addressed and that the Constitutional Court has made a distinction between invasion and occupation. And occupation are acts of desperation, given this context of occupation that I've just obviously very briefly outlined. What we need to be seeing instead is a meaningful and reasonable, and surely part of reasonable would be proactive, response to the housing and land crisis on the part of the state. So I think it's really important to contextualize the current COVID context around demolitions and evictions in this regard, and I hope I've made those links adequately enough. What I'm going to do with the rest of my presentation then is really follow the key points that DAG has asked us to address around alternative accommodation, and in the process I'll be speaking to what the law does around evictions. So I think the important starting point is right at the section 26.3 of the Constitution. There are obviously other sections 1 and 2 which we need to take into account as well, but section 26.3 provides essential procedural protections to unlawful occupiers who face evictions. And in our work with officials and sometimes politicians through SALGA advocacy, for example, this issue conceptually of unlawful occupiers having legal protections seems to be something that people struggle to get their heads around. So a lot of our advocacy work is really on pressing home the point that unlawful occupiers have protections in terms of section 23, and then the PI Act, the Prevention of Illegal Eviction and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act, which gives effect to section 26.3. So 26.3, I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with. It prohibits arbitrary evictions by requiring that evictions be authorized by a court order, after having regard to all the relevant circumstances. So the court order and the relevant circumstances are essential in that clause. I think in terms of the broader topic of this dialogue series, evictions, protection against arbitrary evictions, section 26.3, are really a first step towards tenure security. And we have statutory protections in PI, in ESTA, in the Labour Tenants Act and so forth, that are protect occupiers of different sorts. So I think it's important not to separate section 26 too much from section 25, because underlying occupation is a more systemic problem around land access and land redistribution, equitable land access or land redistribution. So in addition to section 26.3, the PI Act gives effect to that section by requiring that a court consider all the relevant circumstances before making an eviction order. So this requires that an eviction should be just and equitable. So the key issues so far then are an eviction has to be authorized by a court order, the relevant circumstances, and just and equitable. And one of those circumstances or factors includes whether alternative accommodation is available, can be made available by the state. And then the last bullet on this slide is about the case law, the jurisprudence, which has been developing over the last 20 years through litigation. I don't have a lot of time to go through the key cases, but I'm just going to quickly read off my notes here what the essence of the case law is. When evictions lead to homelessness from public or private land in the inner city or informal settlements, the duty is a municipal duty to provide adequate temporary alternative accommodation. Blue Moonlight's an important case in this regard, and we can come back to that because it set out housing rights in relation to property rights, and we can discuss that in more detail because the property was privately owned, but it clarified the state's obligation even on privately owned property. Failure to comply with a court order that provides for alternative accommodation may lead to a finding of contempt of court of municipal officials. municipalities must be party to any litigation that might trigger their obligations. And then regarding occupiers agreeing to an eviction order, the courts have found that consent is legally invalid if occupiers are not informed that they are waiving their constitutional and statutory rights if they agree. And we're arguing it may never be possible for occupiers who risk facing homelessness to consent to their own eviction without a fully fledged judicial inquiry into their circumstances. So at the end of the presentation, I'll just put up a list of resources, because what I was doing there was speaking to one of our publications. What's important, I think, is the implications of evictions and alternative accommodation case law for municipalities. And I've just put up a few bullet points there. We're saying that a municipal approach to alternative accommodation provision should take the implications of the case law as a starting point. So municipalities must adopt a reasonable housing policy, and it cannot only address permanent housing solutions. It must also address adequate alternative accommodation for people who face homelessness due to evictions. So it has to do both. If it's a reasonable housing policy, needs to do both permanent housing solutions as well as temporary alternative accommodation. Meaningful engagement with the parties to eviction proceedings. Municipalities need to be joined to eviction proceedings where the occupiers could be rendered homeless due to the evictions. Municipalities are required to place sufficient information before a court in order for a court to make a decision which is just and equitable. And municipalities are obliged to budget for all people in desperate or emergency need of housing. And they can leverage provincial or national funding to do so. So there's more, but in essence, that's what the implications are for municipalities. Regarding national government, our argument is that we need a national framework to guide municipalities in the provision of alternative accommodation where evictions would lead to homelessness. There are a couple of reasons for that. One of the key ones is that the Constitutional Court hasn't, and the constitutional law experts can speak to this far, far better than I, but courts are reluctant to do so because of overstretching their powers. But we don't have judgments that really spell out what adequate is. So we feel that we need a national policy framework to address this, to provide for guidelines for municipalities. So we've proposed a series of key principles. We've made a submission to the National Department of Human Settlements. SALGA and the City Support Program are both very interested in this question of alternative accommodation, and particularly the national framework that we're advocating for. The other important aspect of National's role is around the emergency housing program. Now, it would be very interesting to hear the experience in the Western Cape. But in our province, and particularly in the city of Johannesburg, the city seldom uses emergency housing funding and has funded alternative accommodation from its own resources. And then there's also a question of transitional housing, which is in a way a larger set. Conceptually, it's a bigger group of temporary accommodation into which alternative accommodation, I think, fits. And I know that transitional housing in Cape Town is fairly well advanced. Then regarding the other role players, private property owners and occupiers. So I think what's important is that the case law, the PI Act, Section 26(3), have really introduced a new paradigm in housing and eviction relations, which do something which apartheid didn't do, and that is balance the right to property with the right of access to adequate housing. And that's what property owners face in this kind of litigation. So their property rights are somewhat limited, but in a temporary way, because and limited in scope. So essentially, until the state takes steps to remedy the situation by providing alternative accommodation, it's until that point that their property rights could be infringed. But they cannot be expected to be burdened with indefinitely. So the courts are saying that private property owners need to be patient, but at the same time, the municipalities need to act relatively swiftly, not to infringe on property rights unreasonably. Property owners are also required to engage meaningfully and place sufficient information before a court because of just and equitable requirement and all the relevant circumstances that are introduced already. So occupiers have significant substantive and procedural protections. They cannot be evicted without first obtaining a court order, and the eviction must be deemed just and equitable. It's likely that part of that consideration will be the provision of adequate alternative accommodation. That's likely to be a crucial consideration. They're also required, occupiers need to provide sufficient information in respect of their personal circumstances. The next issue that I was asked to address was around options for alternative accommodation. And what I wanted to do in this respect is really speak to some practice in the city of Johannesburg. But before I do that, in theory, our view is that different models, in fact, multiple models, are not only acceptable, but probably desirable. So whether that's an NGO, a faith-based organization, city-managed stock, social housing provision, any of these actors could take on the role of providing and then managing alternative accommodation. But in doing so, it's important that municipalities not abandoning its obligation to another party, but whoever acts on its behalf needs to be compliant with the house rules, for example, or the land management rules need to be compliant with what's been established in law. And this is really important for questions like duration, how long is temporary, for gender segregation in some of the alternative accommodation sites, and other aspects like daytime lockout or qualification for access to alternative accommodation. So having given a bit of an overview of the general points, I'm going to quickly take you through these slides of cases that we've been involved in. MBV and Old Perm pertain to the Olivia Road matter. And what has happened here, you can see Old Perm in Hillbrow on the right, and that's an indoor shot of MBV, which was a refurbished military hospital. And what happened in both was that the refurbishment was of a really poor standard, and in particular around issues of water services and plumbing. So occupiers, tenants really now of the city face daily challenges of derelict management, because in this case, the city housing department is the manager, broken security systems and failing water and sewage supply. Moth and liner takes a rise out of the Carr Street case, which is in Newtown, in Johannesburg around the time of the World Cup. Liner takes is the image you see there. So people were relocated to the Moth building, but one floor displaced a fire displaced the residents of one floor. And this really raises issues of building standards and privacy in alternative accommodation provision, because people were not provided, people lived in dormitories, so they weren't provided with private spaces. And as a result, they partitioned with curtains and other materials, thereby raising the risk of fire. So the people who were victims of the fire were moved to Lilatek's house, which is what you see on the picture. And then Wembley is a bit of a more complex story. Shanghai, you might remember, Satis Mansions, I think, and York House. Initially, it was just the residents of the occupiers of Shanghai who were moved to this alternative accommodation. But then subsequently, due to the pressure to provide for additional occupiers, this accommodation became overcrowded, and the city erected tents on an adjacent playing field. And I think it's 4 years now, maybe it's only 2, I can't quite recall, but people have been living in those tents for a substantial period of time, as well as in the accommodation that you see on this photo. And then to move also to the informal settlement context, what we're finding is that it's essentially a case of the city building informal settlements. I suppose this is quite a lot like TRAs in the Cape Town context. The shacks that are built out of corrugated iron are small one-room dwellings with limited living space, substantially smaller than what residents had self-supplied in the informal settlement, of very questionable quality and poor location. So what can be learned from Joburg? I'm going to go to the next slide to summarize it, because I think I might be taking too long. Corey, did you want to, I'm assuming you'll intervene if I need to wrap.
Yes.
I do. Okay. So what can be learned from Joburg? I will skip that slide. The law requires that municipalities provide temporary alternative accommodation if evictions lead to homelessness. But municipalities have been slow to develop proactive alternative accommodation in response to the case law. Where accommodation has been provided, it's generally compelled by court orders and it's insufficient. Management of temporary alternative accommodation has been inadequate, and certain models, such as the managed care model, are constitutionally offensive. The courts have not given content to what constitutes adequate temporary alternative accommodation. So, final slide. We're proposing in this policy brief a municipal approach to alternative accommodation, and we're proposing to the National Department that they should develop guidelines for municipalities in this respect. And bullets 1 to 10 are the key issues that need to be addressed, from planning through to meaningful engagement, adequacy, duration, and so forth, right down to a facilitation role in the provision of permanent housing assistance. So that's a bit of a whistle stop through a range of different sources. And on that final slide is a reference to some of the additional resources that we have available. And I will paste links to those in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren, for your contributions. I am immediately going to shift over to Commissioner du Plessis from the Rental Housing Tribunal. Commissioner du Plessis has been serving as a commissioner since March 2017. He holds a professional 4-year law degree from the University of Pretoria. He is internationally accredited commercial mediator, registered and accredited with the African Center for Dispute Settlement and the Center for Effective Dispute Resolution. Du Plessis holds an NQF and an NQF4 and an NQF5 accreditation as a property practitioner with many years' experience in commercial, industrial, and residential rentals and sales. He has served in the Law Society of the Northern Provinces and is a member of the Western Cape Governing Board for the Western Cape Legal Authority for several years. He also has a long background in property development management as well as contracts and related matters. Commissioner du Plessis, you can go ahead.
Thank you and good afternoon. Can everybody hear me properly?
Yes, we can.
Is my sound good? Okay. Yes, thank you for that very nice introduction and the opportunity to speak for the Rental Housing Tribunal of the Western Cape. Let me start to say I will try and keep it short. The Act dates back to 1999. It's the Rental Housing Act 50 of 1999, and it is really due for a review. There has been publications on a bill, but it has not been finalized, and it is in process with Parliament, and it's, I don't actually know exactly which stage we are at on that issue. But let me start talking about what we do. The rental housing tribunals, and each province should have a rental housing tribunal, tries to arrange and organize dispute settlements. We issue rulings and orders where tenants can bring complaints and landlords can bring complaints. So it's a position that we take, that we try to balance the rights of both landlords and tenants. Now, complaints can be brought to the rental housing tribunal via the website. They can make inquiries whether they have any rights that are being infringed on, or they can lodge formal complaints. The complaints can take any form, in that unpaid rental, municipal services that are not provided, maintenance that's not done, deposits that are not returned, or even other matters. But as I've been listening to the webinar, a lot of focus is about evictions and land occupation and providing proper alternative housing and so on. So I'm going to start with that, because I think that is an issue that many people will want to have answers on. The questions that we are confronted with when it comes to evictions is often whether this tribunal can do evictions from a landlord side. And the answer is no. Section 13 brackets 14, subsection 14 is specific to say this tribunal cannot do evictions. But what we can do is where people are illegally evicted without a proper court order from a magistrate's court or a high court, is where people are locked out, they're evicted, their services are interrupted, such as water or electricity, by a landlord. And I'll get back to that just now. The tenant can approach this tribunal, or any of the tribunals for that matter, to ask for a spoliation order. The spoliation order means that we can restore occupation to the locked out person. We can order the provision of water, basic water supply to the tenants, and or electricity and sewage. And where there's maintenance issues, where a person sometimes are evicted by removing a door, or sometimes we get they remove a roof, or they remove the ceilings, they remove windows, they do funny things like that. We can order that to be restored, and full and free occupation of that property be restored to the tenants. The key issue is, when can I bring an spoliation application to the tribunal? And the answer is, there must be a tenant and landlord relationship. The rental housing tribunal only deals with housing rental related issues. If it's an uncle staying with a nephew and he's just a visitor and he's unfortunately asked to leave and there's no rental relationship, the rental housing tribunal is not the correct forum to approach. In that instance, you will approach a magistrate's court. Unfortunately, we only have limited jurisdiction, and rental relationships is the key. So the advice I can give is, where you are a landlord or a tenant, in any landlord-tenant situation where it's rental housing. Now, this excludes beds and breakfasts with people that charge on a daily rate, like a bed and breakfast, a hotel, a motel, those kind of accommodation that we know as holiday or business accommodation, that would be excluded unless it's a long-term accommodation and there's a rental contract. That is very important. When you have a case where you have been spoliated, where you have been deprived of water, where you have been deprived of your occupation of your property as a tenant, without a proper court order, without a magistrate's or a high court order, you can approach this tribunal. The advice I wanted to say is, make sure that when you have a tenant and landlord relationship, that you are on a sound basis, that you have a proper verbal or written lease agreement. And when you have a verbal lease agreement, ensure when you do the lease agreement, when you enter into that, that you have a reliable witness. The problem we often are faced with is that the one party would say, I have a verbal lease agreement with the landlord, and the landlord would say, this is not my tenant. I have no lease agreement with this person. The person only pays to contribute to the municipal services or something like that. So that is very important. Other issues that I'm going to go on to now are, what are the other complaints that you can bring to the Rental Housing Tribunal? And on that point, any of the rulings or orders made by the Rental Housing Tribunal is the same as a magistrate's court. So the effect of a ruling by a housing tribunal is the same as a magistrate's court, and the execution of those orders are done under the Magistrates Court Act. So let's say a monetary award has been made to a party, and the other party refuses to oblige or pay, then the aggrieved party with the order in his favor or her favor will bring that order to the magistrate, to the Rental Housing Tribunal support office. They'll issue a writ of execution, and the writ will be executed by the relevant sheriff of the magistrate of that area. So if you're in Khayelitsha, it will be the Khayelitsha sheriff. If it's Milnerton, it will be the Milnerton sheriff, and so forth. So what is a dwelling? Now, that is often a question, and I'm going to read the definition of a dwelling. The Act says, under the word description part of the Act, Section 1 says, a dwelling includes any house, hostel, room, hut, shack, flat, apartment, room, outbuilding, garage, or similar structure which is leased, as well as any storeroom, outbuilding, garage, or demarcated parking space. Now, the demarcated parking space would relate to, you have a dwelling and you have a demarcated parking space like in a complex, which is leased as part of the lease. So now, often the question is, I've been renting from a landlord, but I've only dealt with an agent. There's always only been an agent representing this landlord. Who do I address? What do I do with my complaint? Yes, you bring your complaint to the rental housing support offices. And what is a landlord? A landlord, and the Act says a landlord means an owner of a dwelling which is leased and includes his or her duly authorized agent or a person who is in lawful possession of a dwelling and has the right to lease or sublease it. This means if you're a landlord and you appoint an agent to act on your behalf and do your leases and rentals, then as long as that agent is duly authorized, that agent acts in place and stead of the landlord and can be a party to the dispute. In other words, the tenant can make a complaint or lay a complaint against that agent. The landlord will ultimately be responsible for monies and so on. And what is a tenant? A tenant is a person or persons that rent from a landlord or through an agent rents from a landlord. And also, in that case, a landlord will bring his complaint to the Rental Housing Tribunal. For instance, non-payment of rental, non-payment of municipal services where such was agreed. Make sure, landlords, that you have proper evidence, proper bookkeeping, and proper paperwork to come and prove your case. That is very important. Tenants, the same. The better your evidence, the better your support documentation that you can bring to the tribunal, WhatsApp messages where acknowledgements are made, etc. Don't hesitate to bring those. In any case where any a complaint is brought to the tribunal, the support staff of the tribunal's office, which is also called the Rental Housing Tribunal in the Western Cape, that administrative office and the case officers will assist you with completing your case, investigating your case, and then, you know, ultimately it will be, the dispute will be resolved by either a mediation that will be, parties will be invited first to do a mediation and try to settle the dispute along that way, or if that is not possible or not feasible, i.e. the parties might be so far apart from each other on the dispute, the matter will be heard by a panel of the tribunal, which will be no less than 3 members commissioning that, presiding over the matter. So a lease will also be, sometimes people will want to define what is a lease under the Rental Housing Act. Now I'm just talking about the Rental Housing Act. A lease means an agreement of lease concluded between a tenant and a landlord in respect of a dwelling or house for housing purposes. Now I've read what a dwelling is, so it could be any house, room, hostel room, shack, flat, or apartment. There is a difference when you are renting only land. I'm now renting a piece of land and I'm putting my own structure on there. The question is, does it fall under jurisdiction of this act? Now, there aren't very good case law on this, and the stance would be that if it's your own structure that you put up, you are renting only the land. Now, why is that excluded in this act? Because you also have parks, you have farms, you have small holdings, you have all those kind of other forms of leases. You have commercial buildings that people might live in, but it's a commercial building. That would qualify as a housing rental when you rent it for housing purposes. But if you rent it for a factory and you live in it, then it might be a commercial lease and it will fall outside the ambit of this act. So I'm just going to end off by saying there are 2 types of leases. There's a periodic lease, which means the rental is on a month-to-month basis, and the notice period for terminating the lease would be 20 business days as per the Consumer Protection Act of 2008. And if it's a period, I'm sorry, if it's a fixed term lease, the Consumer Protection Act of 2008 will apply, and that's 20 business days notice to terminate. And termination is not a breach, it's a right. Certain other rules might apply under that act, but I'm not going to go into that. A periodic lease falls slap bang under the ambit of this Rental Housing Act. And then when you want to terminate your lease, you can give 1 calendar month notice, starting on the first day of the month, ending at the end day of the month. Just a short, in summary, the complaints we hear for rentals is non-payment of municipal fees, non-payment of rental, maintenance that's not done on a property, where municipal services are interrupted. Municipal services, if you bring a complaint to the Rental Housing Tribunal, it's important to remember that when you bring that complaint for municipal services, and I'm talking water and electricity, that the water was not interrupted by the municipality, but by the landlord disconnecting the water or shutting off the water to the tenant. The same with electricity. The constitutional right to have water means that where a municipality will interrupt your water, the water will only be put on what they usually talk about as a trickle system, a 300 liter per day to the premises and so on. Now, that is a different story because the landlord didn't interrupt the water supply. Same with electricity. In the Western Cape, we have the unfair practices regulations dating back to 2002. Some of the regulations are a bit old, but they are still applicable. And in that case, where you have electricity that you might want to interrupt to a tenant, you must make sure that the tenant is in arrears with electricity and that you have given proper notice to the tenant to correct the arrears. Now, in all circumstances, in all contracts, it's always good to, before you engage into a dispute, is to give each party a chance to perform. Make provision for performance. Ask a party to perform. If a party can't pay the rentals due to COVID or loss of income or whatever, enter into a sort of a moratorium to see how they can catch up, how you can assist each other. A lot of complaints that we do get to close on complaints is return of deposits. People don't return deposits. Landlords often, and I mean often, a lot of our complaints are for non-return of deposits, where the landlord just doesn't pay back the deposit. There were no proper inspections, so you get a before and after picture on the property. The property was not in a good condition when the tenant moved in, for instance, and there's some wear and tear. All sorts of factors must be taken into consideration, and the deposit is just simply not returned. Now, that is unacceptable. And lastly, deposits must always be kept, in terms of this act, in a savings account that bears interest on a compound basis by the landlord, and that money is always the tenant's money until it becomes due to damages or unpaid rental or so on. I think that concludes my short contribution, and I would answer any questions if necessary, and I think I can just also type questions on the screen. I thank you.
Thank you to Commissioner and to Lauren for those very interesting and insightful presentations. Before we proceed to the next session, I mentioned at the start of the webinar that we would have a poll running. So I'm going to ask that we put those poll questions up now, and that you please respond to the questions that we have. We are very interested in hearing your feedback. So on your screen now, you should have a pop-up that says question 1. Please select your response. We'll leave it there for about 10-15 seconds. And then can we put up the second poll, please? We'll give you a few seconds to respond to that one also. Thank you. So because of time constraints, I'm going to move right into plenary, but I'll start with the questions posed to Lauren and the Commissioner, and then we can return to more general questions after that. For Lauren, you had highlighted during your presentation some examples of where alternative accommodation was provided. One question though, are there good instances where the municipalities have complied with the constitutional obligations in providing alternative accommodation? And in those instances, what worked that could be replicated in other instances? And then a second question, what obligation do private owners have in terms of the provision of alternative accommodation? I remember that you mentioned that they can't have an obligation into perpetuity, but just reflecting on that a little bit. And then for Commissioner du Plessis, does the tribunal have enough capacity to deal with the increasing backyard dwellings, particularly if there are informal lease agreements, or does the tribunal only work under formal lease agreements? And then secondly, has the tribunal experienced any cases from people renting in council homes where the landlord is a local municipality? I think I'm going to hand over to the two of you to respond, and then we'll return to more general questions.
Okay, thank you. I'll go first, Andre and Karita, if that's okay. Okay. So on the first question around examples of good, is there good practice, basically? There are aspects of the relocation sites which are good, but I'm afraid on the whole, the experience has been quite negative. What's good about it in all cases is that people's rights not to be evicted have been protected. And people have got access to formal accommodation with services. However, given the weaknesses in management and maintenance, what's often happened is security problems, plumbing problems, so the services do get a bit compromised. The security issues means that tenure security can be compromised to some extent. But I think we have to balance those. So it's not a particular instance that I would highlight, but I would highlight aspects of all the cases where people's fundamental rights have been protected. And as a result, their lives have improved in several respects, but over time, we've seen a deterioration. And then regarding private owners, the obligation is municipal to provide the alternative accommodation. And that is, I think it's a very interesting question. In fact, we've just launched a series of water rights cases, and one of them is the provision of services on private land. And the judgment in the Pietermaritzburg High Court also reaffirmed that the state has an obligation. So I think the issue is really, what is the role of the private sector in relation to the state's obligation? And I don't think that's been explored extensively. But in Johannesburg, social housing organizations, JOSHCO, which is really is a city entity, so it's not really the private sector, but has been involved in management of some of the accommodation, and faith-based organizations have been involved, but the private property owner is not required to provide the alternative accommodation.
Commissioner? You are on mute.
Sorry, I'm unmuted now. Am I? No.
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. I'll start with the second question about complaints against municipalities. There are two issues here that are important. One, if you're renting from a municipality or any other entity and you're not an employer, and listen, your housing is not part of your contract, your service contract, your employment contract, yes, you can bring such a complaint to the Rental Housing Tribunal. We have had several of those. If you work for a university or Transnet or a municipality and housing forms part of your employment agreement, that would be an employment issue. And your first resource for solving that would be the CCMA. That would be my answer to the first one. Second one, I saw the question about informal housing rentals. A rental is a rental. I've given the definition of what is a dwelling. My answer to that is yes, we have capacity. We have made special provisions to have extra sittings for the tribunal during this November to deal. We've been dealing with backlogs. The staff has been geared up. We do virtual hearings. We've done a lot. We are still battling a little bit with technology, as everyone. I think it's a matter of capacity on the internet itself. and fiber lines and whatever you have out there in this virtual space that sometimes hampers us. But yes, we do deal with those, but the complaints must come to the Rental Housing Tribunal's offices at the Department of Human Settlements. Your inquiries can go there. Currently temporarily situated in Norton Rose House in Riebeek Street near Adderley, because they are revamping our hearing rooms and the whole section in Wales Street. So when you do bring your complaints or your inquiries to find out if you do have a complaint, please bring it to the 6th floor of Norton Rose House in Riebeek Street, and that is between Long and Adderley.
Thank you. I think I want to ask maybe just two final questions, and I'll pose them to all of you. I think the first one relates to what proactive measures can we do to prevent land occupations in general? Further to that, what can a person or a household who have found themselves homeless due to an eviction do to address their immediate need to shelter, especially in instances where no alternative accommodation is provided? And then maybe one final question, is there anywhere in the world a successful model of where affordable housing for the poor is provided that can be replicated in Cape Town?
Am I muted? Can I just say something on your question?
Sure.
Please, where tenants are evicted illegally, remember that we regard those as urgent. So an urgent complaint can be brought to the Rental Housing Tribunal, and hopefully, if we have all the documentation in place, like we have contact details for the landlord and so on, the matter will be heard very, very soon. It will most probably be heard in 24 hours. All we have to do is notify the landlord via email or telephone call, or we'll send a official out to notify him that there's going to be an urgent hearing. So all spoliations, evictions, or where water is cut off by a landlord, or electricity is cut off, or roofs or windows are removed, any of those illegal actions, we will regard it as urgent. So I just wanted to, I forgot to say that. Thank you.
Would any of you like to respond to the questions? Specifically looking at backyarders and informal residents who have been evicted, what immediately can they do after an eviction if they find themselves in a state of homelessness?
I'm happy to have a go at that. Okay. I think that there are a number of channels open, but some of them are not urgent enough. But there is the urgent court route. That's what happens in cases that SERI deals with, where you can get a fairly immediate hearing. So it's about contacting a public interest law organization or going to legal aid. And then I think for the rest of it, it's about using the formal political channels of ward councillors and so forth, as contested as those might be, or contacting, being in touch with the social movement or organization in your area. But in terms of the law and the court route, it's to contact an organization that can assist you or go the legal aid route. I'd also like just to respond to proactive measures. Sorry, Paul. The proactive measures, I think, around occupation, I think we've got some of it in place, but it's not delivering at scale. So the one proactive measure is informal settlement upgrading. We need to implement it at scale and in situ, rather than greenfield relocations. The other one is we need affordable public rental using CRU or whatever other mechanism, social housing going down market. And then we need a more programmatic approach to alternative accommodation provision. Thanks.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Gerda. I think I was gonna have a stab at the previous question you asked about what can be done, especially in the backyard / informal or informality context when one has faced an unlawful eviction. And what we have been telling people, in addition to what's already been said with regard to rental housing tribunal and what Lauren has touched on, the urgent court route, we've also been advising in terms of the lockdown regulations. So one of the more immediate steps one can take is to call the police, as in when you are experiencing an illegal eviction, be it on privately owned property or an unlawful demolition of sorts by the state. Because at the moment, as we are still in lockdown, the regulations are still in force, and contravention of these regulations have and do constitute an offense and should be dealt with by the police. So one of the more immediate steps you can take, pick up the phone, call the police, and inform them of the illegal eviction or demolition that you are facing.
Thank you. Vianney, would you like to respond to any of the questions? Maybe at the same time, while you're doing that, won't you give your final comments? And similarly, I'll ask from the other panel members to each give final comments before we conclude. Vianney?
Yes, my leader. I would suggest that that our government at local level in particular should not respond to violence by violence. The best way is to look around and see who are the role players in the area, who are the community activists, because that move will make it easier for the government officials to interact with communities that are most affected, so as to avoid unnecessary confrontation. Because people can easily identify with community activists. And once you start communicating as a government official through community-based organizations, then it becomes a community issue that is resolved at community level. They must not think that they can come from above and start instructing people. It does not work that way. They should approach a community-based issue through community-based organizations. That's why we keep on asking the government officials to say, use us as community-based organizations, because we are not looking for political power here. We are here to assist, to work with government as community-based organizations. That's who we are. We do not instigate violence. We denounce violence. That's us. But we will advocate for community rights, for people's rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any of the other panel members, any final comments? Laura and Paul, Commissioner? Okay, if there are none, I think I'm going to try and capture some of the key issues that came forth today. I think one is a very sort of strong emphasis on the importance of consultation, participation, and meaningful engagement around issues of land and housing with communities before and during an eviction. And it's important, I think the point was made, to work together for both parties to try and find common ground in a space where you have competing interests. We need to engage to find solutions. There's no sense in having an adversarial approach to an issue that is really based on the need of people. So within that context, also for people to effectively engage and consult, it's really important that they have information and knowledge. And I think one of the things that came up strongly or that stood out for me from Paul's presentation is how alarming she said it is that many tenants and landlords do not know their rights. And even within the context of backyard, regardless of the context, whether it's backyarders, informal settlements, or people who are renting, who have formal sort of rental agreements, they don't know their rights. And especially for those who are poor and marginalized, as she had said in her presentation, knowledge of one's rights is empowering in a disempowering situation. So I think it's really important that we sort of make people more aware of where they can, of what their rights are and how they can get access to those rights, in addition to sort of creating the mechanisms through which they can access rights. And I think Lauren did really well also in contextualizing occupations in particular, and not just occupations, but backyard rentals and the space within evictions have found a place, especially during the lockdown period. And that is the failure of the market to deliver affordable accommodation for everyone. And added to that, the failure on the part of the state to adequately respond to the housing crisis. And I think that's the important focus of that problem, and that's where we should start. It's the housing crisis, and in most instances, instead, that's how occupations come about. That's why we have challenges with the growth of informal settlements. And I think another key issue that came up for me was the difference between invasion and occupation. In many instances, occupations are called invasions, but in reality, as Lauren said, they are acts of desperation. And I think Puyani also did really well in explaining to us exactly what that means when we say acts of desperation. It's because we don't have any other alternative. So what is required, as Lauren said, is meaningful, reasonable, and proactive responses driven by the state and government in terms of creating circumstances which that means that it's not necessary for anybody to occupy a piece of land, whether it's public or private land. And I think perhaps one final thing to mention is that legal support is important, but not all eviction cases need to end up in a court. And that is why alternative mechanisms such as mediation implemented through the avenues such as the Rental Housing Tribunal or NU's advice assemblies are so important. And I think that's my brief, short summary of key points that I picked up. Of course, there are many questions in the chat box to which we couldn't respond and for which we didn't have time to have speakers respond. Like I said earlier, we will pick those up in a communication further. We will try to respond to those through various means. But we'll also share our Urban Land Bulletin where we'll sort of tease out more of these issues. Once the Urban Land Bulletin is completed, we will put it on our website and you can look for it there. And we'll also use the information collated during this Urban Forum to guide how we take this conversation forward next year when we run the series, continue with the series. And we hope to have all of you join us again next year when we have those conversations. So I think finally what I would just like to do is really thank our panel for availing themselves to come and share their insights, to discuss these issues, and to sort of raise awareness around the options that there are available and what still needs to be done to address these challenges. I also want to thank you, everyone who participated in the webinar, for your comments, your questions, the manner in which you engaged with us. We really appreciate it. If you want to keep the conversation going, feel free to use our Facebook page, communicate with myself or DAG staff, and we're always happy to keep the conversation going. And then finally, I just want to thank everybody at DAG for assisting with coordination of the webinar. in particular Zinzi Kundai, Akona Kathy, and Adi, who's the Executive Director, for his support. Thank you, everybody. And with that said, I'm going to close the webinar here. May you all have a good day. Thank you.